will make their presentations and will ask questions of each other. Then we will take a very short break. After the break, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions of either or both speakers. Our moderator will explain the proceedings in a bit more detail in a few minutes. If you are a Wayne State student and would like an opportunity to follow up on this evening's debate, there are two opportunities to do so. First, fill out one of the comment cards that are being passed out and leave them with one of the Cru students or at one of the tables out in the hallway. Cru will follow up with you. Also, if you are a Wayne State student and would like to receive an invitation to attend a brainstorming breakfast on campus with Dr. Albert Spalding and student members of Ratio Christi, send an email to wsu@ratiochristi.org and put brainstorming breakfast in the subject line of your email. You will receive a doodle I think it's supposed to be Google, I'm not sure. Okay, doodle invitation to be the guest of Ratio Christi at a brainstorming breakfast where you can ask questions and engage in further discussion. And now I would like to introduce the moderator of tonight's debate, Mr. John Bayan. John Bayan is in the Detroit area director for a national organization, the Christian Medical and Dental Associations, that encourages physicians, dentists, and healthcare students in their vision of serving in their vocation and growing as Christians. He has worked with Detroit University students since 1990 when he graduated from the University of Michigan with an engineering degree. He also holds a master's degree in theology. John has been married for 26 years, is blessed with 7 children, and lives in Livonia. Mr. Bayan moderated our Ratio Christi debate this last fall, and we are glad he is back with us to moderate this evening's debate. Please welcome Mr. John Bayan.
Well, good evening and welcome to our debate. It's great to be here. There's been a lot of planning that's gone into it. This is the ultimate debate, if you didn't know it. This is it. Does God exist? Yes or no? We have 2 speakers tonight. Both of them are professors here at Wayne State University. Dr. Albert Spalding will be presenting the case for the existence of God, and Dr. Bruce Russell will present the case against the existence of God. So let me do introductions for them both for a moment. Dr. Spalding is an attorney, certified public accountant, college professor, ethicist, and Christian apologist. He frequently speaks at churches, pastors' conferences, and ethics seminars on topics ranging from Christian apologetics to business and professional ethics. Dr. Spalding has authored several books and dozens of journal articles and is known for his down-to-earth approach to ethical, philosophical, and theological questions. Dr. Spalding holds graduate degrees in law, business, accounting, humanities, philosophy, psychology, and theology. He teaches at the Mike Ilitch School of Business here at Wayne State University in Detroit, and he serves as the faculty advisor to the Wayne State chapter of Ratio Christi, which is a campus apologetics alliance. Professor Spalding also serves as an adjunct faculty member at Geneva College in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, where he teaches courses in Christian apologetics and Old Testament wisdom literature. His most recent book is The Gift of Dread: How Your Search for Meaning in Life Can Lead to God. So let's welcome Dr. Spalding tonight, please. I'm also honored to welcome Dr. Bruce Russell tonight as well. Dr. Bruce Russell is a Wayne State University faculty member, which we're fortunate to have. He's been on faculty here since 1978, when he came here after earning his bachelor's degree in mathematics and his PhD in philosophy from the University of California at Davis. Professor Russell is a member of Wayne's philosophy department, where he has served as chair for 2 5-year terms. He has received numerous awards for excellence in teaching and mentoring here at Wayne State University. Dr. Russell is known nationally and internationally for his work in moral philosophy and epistemology. He has published several essays on the problem of evil, delivered papers on this problem, and has been involved in debates on the existence of God locally numerous times here at Wayne State and around the country, including at West Point. Professor Russell is also interested in the philosophy of film and writes on the films of certain directors like Tarantino and Almodovar on the presence of philosophy in film. And in his spare time, Professor Russell raises goats and grapes on his farm in California, which I gather from tonight's weather he wishes he was at. Well, let me introduce our schedule and our order of events for tonight. So it's fairly straightforward. We'll have 20 minutes each for Dr. Spalding and Dr. Russell to present their initial cases for the existence of God and against the existence of God. In between each of those, we'll have 10 minutes for them to interact with each other, to ask questions, and to engage each other. After that 60-minute period, we'll have 10 minutes of closing from each of them to make closing statements and arguments. Following that, we'll have a brief 5-minute break, so you'll be able to go to the restroom and get a drink of water, and then we'll return for a lengthy Q&A from the crowd. We do have a microphone to my right and to your left available for questions. I'll repeat this later, but just to let you know up front, we do give you a free minute to go ahead and ask your question, maybe lay that out and explain it a little, but please no counter lectures, please, from the Q&A microphone. So we will cut that out after a minute. We'll do that pleasantly, but I do have a heavy over there who will try to do that for us, just so we can keep the conversation rolling. So with that, I'm glad to welcome Dr. Spalding to the podium for 20 minutes.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you to the Dean of Students Office for making this possible. Also grateful to the KT Family Foundation for its support of this event. Also for crew. How many crew folks do we have here? Yeah, so we've got lots of crew folks here. And thanks to Professor Russell. It's a real privilege for me to be here on this platform with Dr. Russell. Do you have any high school students here? Let me just see if any high school students. We have a bunch of high school students. I'll tell you what, if you find your way to Wayne State, you need to take a class from Dr. Russell. He will help you think more carefully and critically. It will be a good thing for you to do that. Dr. Russell is in the philosophy department here at Wayne State, and you might not know that the philosophy department here at Wayne State has a very strong and rich history. One of the great philosophers, if you will, or at least problem solver, was a man named Edmund Gettier, and if you look up Edmund Gettier, you'll learn about the Gettier problem, and you'll learn about Wayne State. Another person who's very famous, who started their career here, was a man you're going to hear about maybe a little bit tonight. His name is Alvin Plantinga. Started out here at Wayne State. And so this is a prominent department, the philosophy department here at Wayne State. And Dr. Russell is prominent as well. I mean, I have met people like Doug Guyvett and William Lane Craig. Dr. Russell has debated them. So I might be a little bit out of my league here, but I'm going to give it a go. It's been a real privilege for me in the last number of years to be able to speak at churches and pastor conferences and Bible studies. I enjoy being transparent about my faith, and I enjoy exploring what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. It's also been a privilege for me to teach here at Wayne State at the Mike Yellers School of Business, where I get to teach, among other things, business ethics. I also get to teach business ethics in a corporate and professional settings through the Michigan Association of CPAs, the American Institute, and others. And the difference is that when I'm in a church setting, I am transparent about my faith. When I am in a graduate course or a professional seminar, I'm really not as much focused on ethical norms as such, but I'm focused on helping people think about how they arrive at their ethical norms. When I'm involved with Ratio Christi, Student Apologetics Alliance, I get to put the two together. And tonight I get to put the two together. So it's a real privilege for me to be able to do that this evening. My wheelhouse, if you will, is professional ethics. So I'm going to start there, and then we'll move along into the subject of God and the subject at hand. So on the screen you see a sort of North American football goalposts, and it's sort of my little model that I use when I think about ethics, because generally whenever I ask the question, what is ethics, among the answers I get, the most common one is do the right thing. Of course, then the question is, follow-up question, what is the right thing? That gets to be interesting sometimes. And by the way, how do you know that that's the right thing? And the question of how I come to know or how I know about what I think I know about right and wrong is this notion of epistemology, which is a word you heard when you heard John talking about Dr. Russell's expertise. And so when I think about ethics, we want to ask, where does it come from? And so the source of ethics, is it sort of horizontal? Is it something that includes our emotion, sort of gut instinct? I know the right thing because I know it in my gut. Is it human reason? And reason we think of as being sort of pure, but human reason really never is truly pure. In fact, one of my favorite book titles from a person named Stephen Shapin is about science. And it says, Never Pure, Historical Studies of Science as if it was produced by people with bodies situated in time, space, culture, and society, and struggling for credibility and authority. So scientists have skin in the game. And so it's difficult to say anything that is done is truly pure reason? Or is it something that we sort of take on as part of our culture, part of our society, how we're raised? Sociologists will tell you that people's ethical values have more to do with their upbringing than just about anything else. And so these are all part of it. And then, of course, there is some theory that our ethics is really something that we got from evolution. It's an instinct. It's a moral instinct. Which I sometimes call monkey morality, because evolution is really about surviving and making babies, killing and making babies. It's not really lending itself to altruistic moral values. We can stop there. We could stop there if we wanted to truncate our discussion, but that wouldn't be real helpful because most people have some sense of God, and so they can't help but think about, where does God fit into all of this? And in fact, that's a good question, because when we think about ethics, we think about moral principles, we think about higher moral values, and the more vertical we go, the more we sort of find ourselves moving in the direction of thinking about God. One of my favorite atheist writers is Jean-Paul Sartre, who acknowledged that the atheist finds it extremely embarrassing that God doesn't exist, because there disappears with God all possibility of finding values. There can no longer be any good a priori, since there is no, and here's his wonderful definition of God, there is no infinite and perfect consciousness to think it. And then he goes on to talk about sacred text. There is nowhere written that the good exists. He also goes on to talk about sort of a famous aphorism that comes from Dostoevsky, and that aphorism is, let me just get to it here, there it is, without God, everything is permitted. So when we think about ethics, we can't help but sort of going vertical a little bit. And that, in fact, moves us in the direction of what we could call God consciousness. Because if we don't have that, if all we're doing is working with what is preferential to us or detrimental to us, what is coming at us from a horizontal plane, if that's all we have, then the uprights get a little wobbly. It looks like they're kind of in sand and tilting. We lose a lot of that foundation without that sort of verticality that we think that comes from God. So, what I want to be able to say tonight is what can be known about God is plain. And I've already started talking about that in terms of objective morality. I also want to talk about it in terms of God consciousness. Most people are here tonight because they have some sense of God consciousness. Even if you think of yourself as an atheist or an agnostic, you can't be sure. And you have to ask yourself, is there something out there that tells me that God does exist? And I don't know why that nice bass drum sound keeps coming up every once in a while, but I feel like I'm at a rock concert or something. But one can't be completely sure. Peter Singer was here on this campus. In fact, he was joined by Dr. Russell on a debate panel. And I heard Peter Singer one time say that one can never totally exclude the possibility, I suppose, that there is a God, but it seems to me so improbable that I'm prepared to call myself an atheist. Jacques Derrida, an atheist, did the same thing. He said, I rightly pass for an atheist, but he wouldn't actually claim it. Even Richard Dawkins, when asked about, what confidence level do you have, and he said, well, if on a scale of 1 to 7, belief in God, or belief that there is no God, I'm maybe about a 6. There is this notion that we have about omnipresence, which bothers us a little bit. If God is everywhere, He's here right now, that's kind of troubling. His sovereignty, His justice, His love, His personhood. And that God consciousness, or sensus divinitatis, as it was called by two people whose names don't show up in the same sentence very often, John Calvin and Thomas Aquinas, both referred to this sensus divinitatis, and Dr. Russell has had some things to say about that as well. So God consciousness, I'm going backwards here, God consciousness is another thing that can be known about God, that triggers our thinking about God. Another one is just mere existence, the fact that anything exists at all. This notion of sort of nothing comes from nothing, nothing ever could. This idea that something can't come from nothing, and yet here we are, we exist. And no matter how they try, the astrophysicists have tried to come back, sort of go behind reality, behind space, time, energy, and matter, and they still wind up with something. It might be a quantum vacuum or a quantum flux, but it's still something. It's not nothing. And so that leads us to kind of thinking writ large about the possibility of God. Stephen Hawking, known for a lot of things, including being a TV star, was asked the question, he said, we asked the question, why is it that we and the universe exist? If we find the answer to that, it would be the ultimate triumph of human reason, for then we would know the mind of God. Stephen Hawking, then we would know the mind of God. The mind of God, 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 God. The mind of God, 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 God. It echoes. The mind of God. And that's what we think about when we think about existence. And the mind of God is also what kind of informs us about our own consciousness. We make intentional, volitional choices. We purpose our way through life. And that volition, that heart, that sense of choice is what makes us who we are, and it makes us accountable for who we are. In law, we don't convict someone for a serious crime unless there is what's called mens rea, unless there is volition. And that intentionality is something that psychologists and psychology theorists have a lot of problems with. Sir Karl Popper, who was an agnostic, said that the emergence of full consciousness is indeed one of the greatest miracles. We also have from the mind of God the notion of biological information. And so that we know we're made up of an information system. We know that we have 3.1 billion bits of information in our DNA. And so we have even the very person who discovered the genetic code, agnostic or atheist, depending on the day of the week that he would talk with, Francis Crick, said, "An honest man armed with all the knowledge available to us now could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going." So we have the mind of God sort of informing DNA and informing information. We also have the mind of God informing physics. Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize winner for quantum electrodynamics, said, "Why nature is mathematical is a mystery. The fact is that there are rules, the fact that there are physics rules at all is a miracle." And so, wait a minute, didn't I just say miracle? Didn't I just say the word miracle out of the mouths of several atheists? That's fun. I love it when atheists use the word miracle, but they're using it in reference to consciousness, to biological information, to the laws of physics. So the other thing that we can do, though, if we talk about objective morality, that's kind of an argument. If we talk about God consciousness, that's sort of personal. If we talk about consciousness, biological information, laws of physics, that's sort of evidentiary. Then we have historical. We have this historical event called resurrection. And Gary Habermas, whose father actually taught here at Wayne State at one point, earned his PhD at Michigan State University, not known for his theological prowess, on the subject of the resurrection. And he developed this notion of minimal facts, that Jesus died by crucifixion, that there was an empty tomb, that people reported seeing the risen Christ, and the explosive growth of the Christian church, all of which are acknowledged by the enemies of Christianity back in the early days. And he said those are the minimal facts that prove, if you will, the notion of the resurrection. What do we do with that? And that's evidence, that is a miracle. And when we talk about a miracle, we have to acknowledge evidence of God. There's also this idea of existential dread, this idea that we go through life focusing on our rathers that are beyond our reach. We'd rather have approval and acceptance. We'd rather have significance. We'd rather have power and control. We'd rather have comfort. We'd rather have sexual arousal and fulfillment. We'd rather have the next level of prowess on our video games. We'd rather have true intimacy in our relationships. We long for meaning in life, and yet the paradox of hedonism is the more we try to go after those things, the more we try to grab them, the more they're beyond our reach. And so that, once again, puts us in kind of a bind where we have to find ourselves asking, where, God, where are you, and are you? And when we do that, it's very personal. We almost pray this prayer from thousands of years ago. Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you in turmoil within me? So then we think about God. And when we think about God, and we think about His omnipresence, we think about His sovereignty, we think about His justice, we get a little bit worried because we realize that we don't match up. And we realize that the standard of God, God's standard of holiness and righteous, is a little more narrow than our football uprights that we would like them to be. A holy, perfect God who creates the cosmological constant to the 120th decimal point is, if you will, fearsome, if not terrifying. What do we do about that? And so it's a reality check. If God exists, God is holy and righteous. God exists. I've already gone through some of the indicators of God's existence. God is holy and righteous. That makes us fearful. But that's not always a bad thing. because the fear of the Lord can actually be the beginning. If God is, then if I begin to develop a sense of who God is, that's good. Now I've got reality. Now I've got truth going for me. And I'm better off than I was before. But I'm going to give you lots of reasons to reject God, and I'm not going to rebut them later on. So let me just rattle through them. Who wants to fear God? Who wants to subject ourselves to a ruler, to a king? Who wants to be accountable? Who wants to be worried about going to hell? Who wants to be ashamed if God is present and seeing me at all times in the presence of God's eyes? Who needs that? Who wants to be subjected to absolutist moral values? Who wants to have limits on their life choices? There are lots of reasons to reject God and ways to do it. We can demand more evidence. Richard Dawkins one time was asked a question. He said, what if there was a 900-foot Jesus with a voice like Paul Robeson who showed up in front of you? Would you believe then? And he said, no. Which reminds me of exactly what happened to the risen Christ in Matthew when they knew that Christ had risen from the dead, and he's walking around. People are really, they're worshiping him. And then Matthew 28:17, some doubted. So that's going to happen. We can demand more evidence. We can ignore the evidence. We can discount the evidence. We can redact the evidence. We can deny the evidence. We can disconfirm the evidence. And I'm going to leave that to Dr. Russell to handle all of that. But I want to ask, if you don't want to reject God, what do you do? How do you get back to God? And let me tell you what won't work. Reasoning with God won't work. I was at a Taekwondo test one time, and there was this great big guy and a 12-year-old, and the 12-year-old was testing for a yellow belt, and the big guy said, don't hit below the belt. What did that kid do? Boom, right below the belt, There was not a lot of reasoning with that kid when that happened. You don't reason with God. And I just blocked it out. Okay, so that doesn't work. You can't negotiate with the almighty sovereign Lord of the universe. Our righteousness doesn't work either. God's not impressed. You go to a judge, your person is convicted of a crime, and they're standing there at the sentencing hearing, and they're saying, or their mother is saying, or somebody's saying, oh, but this person was so good. They scooted to the middle at the conference so that people could sit. I mean, they did everything. And the judge is like, yeah, so, you're convicted. And our religious efforts won't work. Religious efforts is just, the way I pray, what I eat, what I wear, how I go about my business, who I hang with. It's good stuff, but it doesn't impress God because it's just another way of trying to negotiate with God. So that's not going to work either. So there's lots of reasons to reject God and lots of ways to not get back to God. Thank you.
How's that? Can you hear me? So, I'm a little unclear about some things. I'm not quite sure what the arguments are, the evidence is that Byrd has offered for belief in God or the existence of God. One line of argument seems to be about what are the origins of ethics, about right and wrong. And you might think that I'm some sort of subjectivist about ethics, but you'd be quite wrong. I think that ethics are as objective as mathematics. So I want to ask you, Bert, what would you say if somebody asked you the question, what are the origins of mathematics?
Am I on? Yeah, good. I would say mathematics, like logic, like the very ability for you to ask the question, comes from a higher mind, comes from a higher consciousness. So mathematics is created. It doesn't just exist. It's created. The laws of physics are created. Your ability to reason is created because it didn't It didn't arrive as a result of evolution. Evolution teaches you to kill and procreate. It isn't directed to, it doesn't deliver truth, it delivers dominance. And so I look to a creator.
Well, I wonder it's not just about our ability to, say, discover mathematical truths that I'm asking about. It's not how do we discover that 2 plus 2 is 4, but I wonder about the proposition 2 plus 2 is 4. To me, that's a kind of truth that's independent of us or God's existence, that if God didn't exist, 2 plus 2 equals 4 would still be true. So I think the question about origins of mathematics doesn't make sense. And I say the same thing about morality, that genocide and rape and child molestation would be wrong, regardless of whether there's a God or not.
Well, there's two points that you're offering, I think. Let me try to capture both of them. Going back to mathematics, you said 2 plus 2 is going to be 4 always, at all times. That's sort of, it's almost a euthyphro problem. It sort of is outside of God or above God, right? I mean, is that
Outside of everything.
Outside
if we didn't exist,
Right.
2 plus 2 would be
Okay.
4.
And you know, I can't believe I'm going to do this, but I'm actually going to I'm going to talk about the multiverse. Usually theists aren't real excited about talking about multiverses. But you know, an atheist or a philosopher who would talk about other universes and other worlds would not necessarily agree with you that 2 plus 2 is 4, that holds true in that chaotic in some other multiverse. So there is at least some notion that the clarity of 2 plus 2 equals 4, we think of that as truth. We approach that using the logic that we have as a result of our Creator, but it is the Creator that provides the logic and the Creator that provides that truth. You also asked about objective morality, and I would say this. Rape is wrong, but rapists rape. Genocide is wrong, but dictators, and I'm not even going to be gratuitous and say atheist dictators, but dictators commit genocide. So what is wrong to Dr. Bruce Russell is apparently not authoritative with Kim Il-jung or some other dictator. So it's really a theoretical offering that you have is, well, I think this is wrong, unless there is a higher moral principle that you can draw down and point to and say, that's the wrongness right there. There's good and evil. And I can't tell you about the evil. I'm pointing backwards at my shadow here. I can't tell you about the evil unless I can point to the light and to the sun. Then I can tell you the differentiation between good and evil. Otherwise, I'm just making it up as I go along. I think this is wrong. Well, you know, what about if someone is flirting? Is that wrong? I mean, where do you go on the scale? And I know you would say, well, it's obvious. It's obvious to you, but it's not an objective standard.
I can't quite get it yet. I think there's a sense in which God might provide, you could have a view that God provides us the ability, reason to reason logically, but I don't think God makes validity arguments valid or invalid. It's just a matter of fact. If you have an argument that goes if P then Q, P so Q, it's a valid argument no matter whether God exists or I exist or you exist or anyone. And it goes through all of those kinds of logical and mathematical truths, and I don't see why, of course, there are people in the world who don't believe all of these mathematical truths, and there are people in the world who don't believe that genocide is wrong. I don't see how that cuts any ice about whether there is an objective truth about genocide and mathematics. And you could, in principle, I mean, maybe not, maybe so, know the difference between right and wrong without actually encountering them. But suppose I grant you can't, That just means in order to have the concepts, you have to have some experience. But once you acquire the relevant concepts, then it follows necessarily that 2 plus 2 is 4 and the like. So I think you confuse how we get access through our reason to these necessary truths with the independent existence of the necessary truths.
You know, it's kind of like driving a Grand Cherokee and saying, I don't believe there's a factory that makes Grand Cherokees. Let me drive over there and see to the North Jefferson plant and see. Let me drive my Grand Cherokee there. You're using logic, which is itself does not emerge from nature. It emerges from a higher source. You're using logic. You're riding on the shoulders or in the passenger seat of logic in order to arrive at some conclusion, denying the source of that very logic.
It makes me think that this idea that it derives from a higher source, that if God had said something else about if P then Q, P so Q, he could have made it invalid. That seems impossible. It seems impossible that he could have made 2 plus 2 equals 5 or anything else but 4. So it doesn't come from on high logic. There doesn't need to be an extra supernatural being to make the truths of logic and mathematics. We use logic to get from here to there and to make arguments that we're doing today, but that doesn't mean that there's a source somehow that makes these things true. It's the very problem that divine command theories have about ethics. The famous Euthyphro dilemma, one of the horns says, if right and wrong depends on God's will or command, in principle, he could command molesting children to do it, and it would therefore be right. To me, that sounds like he could command 2 plus 2 equals 5 and make it true. That is impossible.
It is impossible. God is not illogical.
So there must be a logic outside of him to which he must, think in accordance with. That he's limited by the logics that he has to obey.
He is the essence of logic and the essence of good, the essence of morality. He is logic. He is good. He is the source of logic. He is the source of good. And you said it doesn't mean that there's a source, but it doesn't mean there doesn't. It doesn't mean there isn't a source either. You haven't shown the other side. And in fact, the P and the Q and the this and the that, there's a lot of both and going on in life. And even in God. God, in the Trinitarian view of God, God is 3 persons. He is 3 separate people and yet one God. There's both and. So God is the source of how we construct these structures. All there is without the orderliness of God is chaos.
I can't understand the claim that God is the source of logic and mathematics and morality unless it means that his will determines the truths in those domains. And that, I think, is a contradiction. He could not make, but I don't think actually, and most philosophers don't, that it's this knock on omniscience, because God, the way I understand omniscience, can do anything it's logically possible to do.
Correct.
But he can't make 2 plus 2 equal 5. He can't make this argument form I gave invalid, and he can't make genocide right.
Are we done?
Time.
Okay, thanks.
Dr. Russell, we invite you up to the podium for 20 minutes.
How's this? You hear me again? Okay, so I want to thank Bert for, he was instrumental in organizing this debate, and I'm pleased to have this opportunity. And I thank him for the kind and generous remarks he made about me in the philosophy department when he was here at the podium. I have a handout. Do all of you have it? Okay, good. It reminds me when I was a graduate student at UC Davis, teaching one of my first philosophy courses, and I got evaluations back at the end of the term, and one of them I treasure, but I've lost it, but I haven't forgot it. And he said, or the person said, I don't know if it was he or she, "This is the worst class I've ever taken in the university. There was nothing but one argument after another." Yep. So here we go. So do I have to step back or what? I'm going to assume that the God that I'm going to talk about and argue does not exist, or there's reason to believe that God does not exist, is a God who's all-knowing, all-powerful, and wholly good. Those three attributes are generally assumed in discussions I have about the existence of God. It's assumed by three of the major religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that God has those properties. He may, or I'll say he, sometimes I'll say she, have more, but that's enough for my argumentative purposes here. So I will start by offering the problem of evil, a famous problem against the existence of God, which is an argument that says God would not allow suffering or unnecessary suffering or way too much unnecessary suffering, and concludes that God does not exist because there is such suffering. There's an awful lot of suffering of innocent people and animals in the world. When I teach philosophy of religion, I look in the Detroit Free Press for examples. First time I published an article about a little girl in Flint who was on New Year's Eve in 1989, was brutally raped, beaten, and then strangled to death by the mother's boyfriend, or at least that was the suspect. His lawyer actually got him off, so he didn't do any jail time. There's a famous case of Ariana Swinson in 2000 where her parents threw her on the floor and because she wasn't eating properly, and then drowned her by pouring boiling water down her throat. And more recently, discovered in 2015, Michelle Blair killed two of her children by putting a bag over their head and beating them, and then put first in 2012 her son in the freezer. Then she killed her daughter in 2013 and put her in the freezer, except she had her other daughter, an older daughter, put the second person, the first daughter, in the freezer. And so they were there for several years, and they were discovered in 2015 when people were evicting her from her house. And then, of course, there are the kind of big cases, the Holocaust, Pol Pot in Cambodia, Armenian genocide, Rwanda, all the suffering and death from tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, floods, droughts, genetic diseases, and the like. There seems to be plenty of suffering to go around. There are three versions of the problem of evil. I'm going to go through a couple and say they're not sound. And then I'm going to settle on one that I think is sound. The first one goes, if God exists, there would be no suffering of innocence, but clearly there is, so God doesn't exist. And I'm going to skip down to the replies and do it that way. So the reply to this first argument is to be able to act of our own free will, to have opportunity to do good or bad, is a great good in itself. Free will is the good, and not only free will, the opportunity to act on our free will. So a good God would want his creatures to have this significant freedom, but they may misuse it and create suffering, so suffering is compatible with the existence of God. Further, some suffering is needed if certain virtues are to develop: compassion, mercy, forgiveness, perseverance, courage, etc. Better to have some suffering and the possibility of these virtues than neither. So for both these reasons, premise 1A is false. Suffering is compatible with the existence of God. That is a good objection. They're right. Second version goes, if God exists, he would not allow the unnecessary suffering of innocents. I give the example in my classes, a dentist can cause some suffering by giving an injection of an anesthetic before he drills the child's tooth, but it's not unnecessary, it's necessary to prevent further suffering later on. But suppose he says, oh no, I'm not going to do that, I'm just going to drill the tooth. This is a bunch of suffering, unnecessary, and if you were a parent and were standing by and could stop it, you would be allowing unnecessary suffering. And of course, you'll think about that dentist and the parent who doesn't stop him, they are not good people. So, the second argument goes, if God exists, he would not allow the unnecessary suffering of innocence, that is, would not allow that unless allowing it was needed to bring about some greater good or prevent some greater bad. But there is unnecessary suffering of innocence, so God does not exist. The reply to this is in 3b below there. To the second version of the problem of evil, here's an example. Peter Van Inwagen, a philosopher at Notre Dame in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, used against me. Imagine that there are 1,000 people on Atlantis, which is sinking, and a good ship's captain can save many by taking them aboard his ship. But for each person he puts aboard, the chance that the ship will sink increases by 0.1%. So if he puts all 1,000 aboard, his ship will definitely sink. If he takes none aboard, they will all drown on Atlantis as it goes under. Van Inwagen says that a good captain must take at least a handful, say 10, and may take all but a handful, say 990. Still, if he takes just a handful, he may leave some behind that he could have saved. They will suffer unnecessarily when they drown. Could have taken them aboard. But according to Van Inwagen, the good captain does no wrong if he leaves them behind. So a good captain could allow unnecessary suffering. If that's true of a good captain, why not of a good God? So premise 1b, this objection says, is false. My first response is, it's not an apt example because the captain has an excuse in that he's non-culpably ignorant of how many he can take aboard and still make it safely to port. But God does not have this excuse. He would know exactly how many to take aboard. None would be left behind unnecessarily. But I think Van Inwagen has a more sophisticated argument in that same reply that this one, the captain passage is from, that assumes there's no minimum amount of suffering that must be allowed to bring about some greater good or avoid some greater evil that reaches the same conclusion as this captain's analogy. Rather than taking time to discuss it now, for the sake of argument, I'll just grant it that it's sound and skip to the third version of the problem of evil. So the third version, turned back, is if God exists, he would not allow excessive unnecessary suffering. There's another example that Van Inwagen gives about a judge who could deter this crime at the relevant level by imposing a 364-day sentence, but he imposes 365, and that's still not unjust or not wrong that a good judge could do that. Yeah, but what if he imposed a life sentence for stealing from a convenience store? That would be excessive sentence. That's what I'm worried about, excessive unnecessary suffering. And that's what argument 3 says. 1c, if God exists, he would not allow excessive unnecessary suffering of innocents. That is, would not allow way more suffering than need be allowed to bring about some greater good or prevent some greater bad. So now what do I say? What do they say about this argument, the critics, and I say, I don't think they can criticize 1C. That one is a necessary truth, that it's true even if God exists or not, like 2 + 2 is 4. So that's what I say about 1C. I don't think you can think of a counterexample to it, but we'll have Q&A, maybe you can. So what I do say is that now the focus is not on the first premise, but on the second one. What reason is there to think that there is this excessive, unnecessary suffering that's crucial, that I assert is the case in premise 2? Well, you might think I gave plenty of examples right at the beginning of my talk about, all of that suffering in Detroit. You just look in the Free Press and the Holocaust, that's quite a bit of suffering. But that's not enough. Here's an argument. Or here's a criticism, actually, I should start with, of premise 2. Theodicies try to show that premise 2 is false. It says there is excessive unnecessary suffering. Theodicies try to say, no, that's false. There is not. I don't think they're going to be successful. I think a lot of philosophers of religion have abandoned theodicies. They can show, as I did when I was criticizing premise 1A, that God would allow some suffering, and because of free will and an opportunity to develop certain virtues, I don't think anybody can explain why there's so much. There's a lot of suffering that's not needed for having significant freedom or to develop the virtues. That I don't think works. The new wrinkle is to offer a defense which says we're in no position to judge whether premise 2 is true or false. We should suspend judgment about premise 2 is the new response. And I say, well, here's a problem. There are people I imagine I call young earthers, and I use the word YES, young earthers with an S, many, that they say something, they have a defense of their view that's similar to the defense that I just sketched, that the skeptical theists. I should go through skeptical theists. Here's the defense. Why do they think we're no in position to judge? First, because there may be goods and bads of which God is aware that are beyond our grasp, beyond our ken, as the skeptical theists often say. So maybe God is to allow all the suffering of innocence that we observe in order to bring about these goods or avoid these bads. Secondly, whether there are goods and bads beyond our ken or not, God may see how allowing all the suffering of innocence that we observe is necessary to bring about these goods and avoid these bads. And this complex path is not accessible to our finite minds. So the conclusion from 1 and 2 is we are in no position to judge that the suffering of innocence we observe is excessive and unnecessary. That's the skeptical theist's basic defense. And the young earthers say this. They say that the world was created recently, 5,000 years ago, 100 years ago, 5 minutes ago. Bertrand Russell imagined once, hey, how do we know that the world wasn't created 5 minutes ago with all the signs of age and you people looking like you're older than 5 minutes and so forth? Possible. And with all the signs of age like fossils, deep river valleys, cave paintings, and so on, and with books and human artifacts that seem old but were also created recently. God did this, here's the young earther story, so we could learn the lessons of history without all the suffering a real history would involve. We can learn about the physical world through the science texts we have. For when God did create the world recently, he created it with all the regularities recounted in the scientific books. And we can learn how to better to live together by reading stories of how people have gone wrong and how right in their interactions. God wanted people to come into existence as prepared as they now are, but without the suffering that would be involved if they really had to acquire this knowledge through a real history. Deception's prima facie wrong, but can be all things considered right if it's needed to avoid terrible suffering and produce great good. The young earthers do not claim to grasp all of God's reasons for doing what he did, say for creating the world just when he did, rather than earlier or later, but like skeptical theists who respond to the problem of evil, they say that some of God's reasons are beyond our ken. What do the skeptical theists say to the young earthers? Here's their argument. If young eartherism is true, then the world was created recently. But the world was not created recently, so young eartherism is false. But the young earthers reply, but we argue that no one is in a position to judge that two is false. We give the same kind of argument that you, the skeptical theists, give against the problem of evil. You say there's a reason why God would allow some suffering, namely significant freedom and opportunity to develop the virtues, and then we have reason to think that some of God's reasons are beyond our ken. We argue, we young earthers, that there's reason why God would deceive us to lessen suffering while at the same time providing us with useful knowledge. And we have reason to think that some of God's reasons are beyond our ken. Our defenses have the same structure and appeal to some human good we humans can understand to explain in part why the world would appear as it does if God exists, and then an appeal to God's having reasons beyond our ken to explain why certain aspects of the world are a puzzle to us. So much suffering of innocence or all the signs of age, respectively. Here's what Bruce Russell says. If the skeptical theist argument against the problem of evil is a good defense, then the young earthers' defense against the skeptical theist argument I listed above is also a good defense. But the young earthers' defense is not a good defense against the skeptical theist arguments. Obviously, it's really not reasonable to believe that the world was created recently. So, the skeptical theist defense isn't a good defense. What is a positive argument for my claim that there's excessive, unnecessary suffering? All I've tried to do so far is to show you that the skeptical theist defense isn't so hot, because it's just like the young earthers' defense, and we all know that one's not so hot. What's my positive argument? It goes like this. The best explanation of apparently excessive, unnecessary suffering, think about the Holocaust and all that stuff I listed at the beginning, we observe is that there is such suffering, not that there's an immaterial God that mysteriously is able to act on the physical world and has reasons beyond our ken for creating it and allowing all the suffering of innocence we observe. We should believe premise 2 because it's the best explanation of what we observe. Could there be, the last section is, can the God hypothesis, the idea that God exists, explain other things that atheism cannot? I've already talked in the exchange with Bert why I think you don't need God to explain objective morality. Objective morality is like math, and you don't need God to explain why math truths are necessary truths, true in every possible world. 2 + 2 is 4, genocide is wrong, they're on a par. How about events or things in the universe, like the structure of the human eye or animal anatomy? These were the kinds of things that people who offered the design argument in the past would focus upon and argue from there to a designer. I think that those events or structures or things in the universe are going to be able to be given scientific explanations. That's what happened with the design argument when Darwin came along and said, wait a minute, I have a non-theistic argument for the origin and structure of the eye. I think every event in the universe promises to be in the universe explained by science. And the success of science in doing that is my reason for drawing that conclusion. Finally, I think the best move for the theist is not to look to explain things with the God hypothesis in the universe, but to explain features of the universe itself. How about the fact that there is a universe, existence? Bert suggested this at one point. Why is there something rather than nothing? Some people say that's a fundamental question in metaphysics, and you naturalists can't answer it, but we God folks can. How about that? Or how about the fundamental laws of nature? What explains that? Or
That's time.
fine-tuning, that if you didn't have the fundamental constants just like they were, we wouldn't have any life or no intelligent life. All those things are universe properties. My answer is that God hypothesis seems a good one at first glance for the features of the entire universe. But here I finish up. There's a problem. This explanation is only deceptively good. What's the problem with it? It introduces mysterious causal relations between an immaterial being, here's an immaterial being, and the physical world. How does that happen? It's a famous problem in Descartes. How would a soul interact with our brains? He said at the pineal gland. That wasn't the answer. The question was not where,
Time is up.
how. Two more?
No, we're done.
We're done?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just pick, yeah, the mic's on the floor. There we go. All right, Dr. Spalding, you have 10 minutes to interact with
Thank you
Dr.
very
Russell.
much.
Give
Well, I'm
him
learning a
moment.
lot of things today. First of all, I'm learning how to get an extra 2 minutes on my speech, so I try to do that maybe, I don't know. Thank you, Dr. Russell, for that careful analysis. And I wonder about the young earther thing. Isn't that really an appeal to possibility? X is possible, therefore young earthers think X is true, and I'm just wondering how helpful that is if it confuses possible with the probable.
Where's the possibility part you're thinking about?
You're saying that young earthers think that it's possible that God created the earth 5 minutes ago, therefore they think it's true.
I'm just saying they follow the exact same reasoning that the skeptical theists do. Namely, there are two parts of the skeptical theist reasoning. Here's a reason why we can explain some things in the universe, like some suffering, by appealing to God, the value of free will, and God's wanting to create creatures with free will and so forth. And we skeptical theists can explain something by the God hypothesis, namely why he really created it recently, because he wanted to make sure that creatures came into existence, us, with a certain kind of useful knowledge, which was not based on an actual history, but on a history implanted in us. And the reason he did this is for two: one, it's useful, and two, it avoids all the suffering that occurred if there was an actual history as we think there is. So those are the reasons why God, wanting to have people minimize their suffering at the same time having important knowledge, created the universe recently. It's not just that it's possible. This is our explanation of, given God's goodness, why he would want to have knowledge and avoid suffering. So,
I mean, we have, there's the possibility and there's a probability. We have, even Alvin Plantinga said, a brain in a vat exercise is not properly basic, because we know we've been around for more than 5 minutes. So I just don't see the helpfulness of the appeal to possibility. But even if that logic makes some sense, you refer to it as skeptical theism, which I know a lot of people do. I think of it as big God theism. God is so large and so omniscient, I can't know what God knows. And if that is a proper stance, if that's agnosticism, then it doesn't follow, does it, that seemingly pointless suffering affirms atheism over theism.
What doesn't follow? Say that again?
If you disconfirm the evidence of God by using this very tight little box of an argument, if you claim to disconfirm the evidence of God, that doesn't then in turn affirm atheism.
So there are two parts to this. So I first give a positive argument. Those are the versions of the problem of evil. And of course, I settle on the third version, because I think the third version's first premise is not criticizable in the way that the other two versions were. So that's my positive argument for the non-existence of God. The next step is I'm trying to meet an objection to one of the premises in my positive argument, namely premise 2. And my appeal to the analogy of the young earthers is to say, wait a minute, your criticism of premise 2 can't be a good one, because the young earthers can mount the same kind of criticism with the same structure as your criticism of my premise 2. And we all know that the skeptical theist criticism isn't any good. Skeptical theist, defense of their view, I should say, isn't any good. So by analogy, by parallel reasoning, yours isn't either. So now I think I've rescued the problem of evil, and what I haven't given so far at this stage is a positive argument for its second premise. The critics were trying to criticize it. I met their criticism, or attempted to, and now I give, in the last part of that section, my own positive inference to the best explanation argument for the second premise. So the argument for God's non-existence is that basic one that I gave right at the outset, the third version.
Okay. So I'm thinking about what we don't know about God, because God is omniscient and we are not, and what we do know about suffering in the absence of God. So we don't know all of the reasons for suffering and evil. We're not God. We don't have a God's eye view. We do know that there are many times, even in our experience, we know there are many times when it seems if something was meant for evil and it turns out to be something that has a good outcome. We know that happens. So there's a lot we don't know about the ultimate purpose of suffering when it comes to theism. That's skeptical theism, as you designated. I call it big God theism. But what we do know about the ultimate purpose of suffering with atheistic evolution is that we do know that there is natural evil, pain, suffering, disease, death, extinction, that these are constitutive of life. They're parts of the biological process. So evil is assumed. It really becomes the problem of goodness, that the universe that we, as Dawkins said, the universe that we observe has precisely the properties that we should expect is if there was no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. In other words, there's no good and evil, but ultimate indifference. So atheism offers us indifference to suffering. Theism shines a light on it and asks us to worry about suffering, just as you have with all these examples of the young children and the mothers and all of that. That actually is because light is shining down and we're looking at the shadow and we understand there's both good and evil. Atheism doesn't offer you any distinction between good and evil. It's just a natural process. It happens all by itself.
Well, the fact that it's a natural process or the outcome of a natural process doesn't mean it's not good, sometimes good things, like people, I don't know, are saved or made happy or something, or they're injured by the tsunami or killed. That it's an outcome of a natural process doesn't mean that it doesn't have moral value or disvalue. Of course, I'm an objectivist about these things about good and bad and right and wrong. So of course I say it's a bad thing if the tsunami or the earthquakes or whatever kill and cause a lot of people to suffer, and a good thing if somehow people are saved from these kinds of events and they're all natural occurrences. So I think that an atheist can well recognize value in the universe. The problem for the theist is there seems to be too much suffering, given that there's a good God who knows about it, has the power to prevent it, and doesn't.
Too much suffering by the measuring stick of Dr. Russell. As
Major
opposed-
stick of what?
By the measuring stick of Dr. Russell. Let me ask it this way. If the tri-omni God, all good, all powerful, all knowing, of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam were to exist, as you would put it, is it in your view an analytical truth that such a God would not allow excessive unnecessary suffering?
Yeah.
Okay. So then, are you saying, irrespective of all the purported evidence for God and any and all irrespective of all the other purported evidence for God, much of which I went through, and I only went through a half a dozen, as you know, there's another half a dozen at least that are traditionally used. Irrespective of all that evidence, any and all unnecessary excessive suffering is evidential disconfirmation of the existence of God.
Yeah, you know, I recently published a paper where I address what's called the G.E. Moore shift, because the G.E. Moore shift in this context says, look, we're going to agree with you, Russell, on 1C, that if God exists, there's not excessive unnecessary suffering. And we're going to argue, and God does exist, and so there's really not unnecessary excessive suffering. And I said, okay, good try. Okay, what is your argument now that God exists? I didn't think that any of the considerations you gave actually were sufficient reason to believe God exists. That we have God consciousness, maybe so. Probably there's a psychological, biological explanation why we have God consciousness. That we have existential dread. There's also a psychological explanation for that. So I don't see that any of the considerations you raise actually supports the premise God exists. You could, in principle, try this G.E. Moore shift to argue, the argument form I have is if P then Q, not Q, so not P. Somebody might try if P then Q, P, so Q, that is, there really isn't excessive unnecessary suffering. I just think that route, I haven't heard the arguments yet that is going to convince me that it's more reasonable to believe that God exists than it's reasonable to believe that there's excessive unnecessary suffering.
Okay, time up. Dr. Russell will come up. We're at the closing part of our discussion, our presentation tonight. So Dr. Russell will go first to present for 10 minutes, and then Dr. Spalding will close with 10 minutes, and then we'll take a break and come back for questions and answers.
So I guess what I'll do, because I was rushing through my last sort of Roman numeral, that I'll finish up with that. And the issue is, so let me go over just what I think the big structure, I kind of was outlining it when I was talking to Bert here at this 10-minute interchange, that I think, okay, I've finally given an argument, the problem of evil argument, that God doesn't exist. The skeptical theists say I'm in no position to judge. It's true, the second premise, that there is excessive unnecessary suffering. I tried to meet their criticism by saying, but by analogy, the young earthers could give the same kind of defense of their view, but we all know that defense isn't any good. But the skeptical theist defense against the problem of evil, my second premise, has exactly the same structure as the young earthers. So if their defense, the young earthers, isn't good, neither is the skeptical theist. This is supposed to then say, now I've got this argument back, it hasn't been defeated, and somebody might say, well, okay, the criticism of your second premise hasn't succeeded, but you haven't given any argument for it. And then I gave the inference to the best explanation argument for my second premise, saying the best explanation of apparently excessive unnecessary suffering is the very simple explanation there is. At the end, I said that I don't think that any theistic argument is going to work, but the most promising ones are the ones that look at features of the entire universe, not events or things or states of affairs in the universe, like the human eye or animal anatomy, but properties of the universe itself. Why does it exist rather than not? Why do we have the laws that we have rather than not some others? And so forth. And I started to say about that, and I'll return to this, that those arguments, that God hypothesis seems promising to answer these questions, but if you dig deeper and see what kind of explanation it is, you'll see where it fails. And where it fails is it introduces mysterious connections between an immaterial being and the physical world. How is it possible that an immaterial being can act on the physical world? How is it possible, people worried Descartes about, that an immaterial soul can affect the brain? That's one problem with the God hypothesis. A second one is it introduces mysterious reasons beyond our ken, for why God allows so much terrible suffering of innocence. And it's not just mystery that we might penetrate. We don't know the causes of cancer, but we don't think that they're essentially mysterious. But this mystery of God, mysterious reasons, because of his infinite mind, is impenetrable in principle to humans. That is a flaw in a hypothesis, that you have to introduce mystery at least in two places. Furthermore, I say, I didn't get to this, but one reason that theists give, claiming the superiority of their hypothesis, is it doesn't allow any brute facts, where the naturalists have to say, there are some brute facts, we have the universe we do, say, with the laws we do. That's an unexplainable fact. But they also have brute facts. The brute fact is that God chose to create this universe rather than one equally good, but not this universe. Why did he choose this one, where he could have chosen another at least equally good universe? So my conclusion is there is a very strong argument against the God that the kind of God I was addressing, all-knowing, all-powerful, and wholly good. It's called the problem of evil. And I gave that argument. I defended against criticisms. I defended then all of the premises, including the second one. And then at the end of my talk, I said, you know, the God hypothesis looks pretty good at first blush about explaining features of the universe that naturalists have a difficult time explaining. But if you press that God hypothesis, it dissolves in your hands. That explanation has all the flaws that I just mentioned in my concluding remarks. Thanks.
Copy of my slides. Thank you, Dr. Russell. How is it possible that an immaterial being can interact with the material world? Dr. Russell, his name is Jesus Christ, an immaterial being, God, interacting with the material world. It's called incarnation. And it is actually the essence of all creation. God spoke creation into existence, and the Word was made flesh. I want to go back to one point that Dr. Russell made about big God theism or skeptical theism. And I just want to say that we don't know that it's always preferable for God to intervene, interrupt, and intercede on when bad things would happen. There's actually a book in the Bible called the Book of Judges, and every time God did intercede and things went well, the wheels fell off morally and spiritually with them. Human nature being what it is, when things are too comfortable, we tend to rebel even more than otherwise would be the case. I'm going to close this. Let me just get to my closing things. I'm going to close with just a quick review, first of all. What can be known about God is plain. Dr. Russell basically said, I haven't proven this or I haven't proven that about these different arguments and evidences, and you're right, I haven't, because I said they infer, they signal, they tell us about God. And so the question is all the signals of transcendence, the opportunities for inference? Well, actually, God consciousness is not inference. God consciousness is direct sense of God's existence and presence. But the ones that are evidential, the question is the one argument that Dr. Russell makes, which is his preference for God to intervene and intercede and prevent certain levels of evil, as opposed to allowing for there to be a distance between man and God and allowing man to want to seek God, that's preferable to justice. I was an IRS agent. The IRS and law enforcement agencies know that you want to make an example of someone, and that does a lot more for deterrence than interception and interruption. So the script that I would flip is if God exists, there wouldn't be any pointless suffering, number one. Number two, God exists. We have objective morality, God consciousness, something from coming from nothing, not coming from nothing, consciousness, biological information, the laws of physics, the history giving us the resurrection, existential dread. God exists, so there's no pointless suffering. And that's flipping the script on his presentation. What can be known about God? God's eternal power and divine nature are plain. If we wanted to go through all of the different arguments talking about intelligent design, we would just be awestruck at the precision of the creation and DNA and the lining up of the planets, the fact that the Earth is positioned perfectly in order to see out and to learn about the rest of the universe. And that is basically what I'm going to do in the last 4 minutes that I have, is to talk about what the Bible has to say, because the Bible is, there's a genre of literature called romance novels. I know it's kind of out of date, but it's still a $50 million industry today. What's the basic theme of a romance novel? Boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl. There you have it. The Bible is not a novel. It's a romance nonfiction. And it's human, or if creation meets creator, creation rebels against creator, and creator finds a way for redemption. That's the story of the Bible. But to get there, we have to understand that there is an opportunity for us to learn about God. For what can be known about God is plain. I've been saying that in my presentations, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his internal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that they have been made. And then the most terrifying 5 words in the English language, so they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give him thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and in their foolish hearts were darkened. We use the word foolish in the Bible. It's not an insult as such. The Bible says that the beginning of wisdom, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and that a fool chooses to not fear God. A fool says in his heart, there is no God. So it's a syllogism or a tautology or an analytical truth or however you want to call it. But it's simply a definition. A fool in the Bible is just someone who rejects God and says there's no God. And so when you see that word, then you have an understanding. I've given you reasons to reject God. And there are more, but we don't want, in our sort of natural sense, we don't want there to be a God. We'll go to all kinds of lengths. Atheist scientists will go to great lengths to come up with arguments to prove somehow that there is no God. They don't want there to be a God. Science is not pure. It's driven by motives. For the mind that is set on the flesh, that is at the natural level, is hostile to God, for it does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. There's a gap. So we said there are ways to not. There are ways that we can't get God back. Let me talk about the way that the romance nonfiction actually ends, because God so loved the world that He gave His Son to redeem those who would believe on Him, so they would not perish. And who are these people? Those who would recognize God's sovereignty and put aside all of the things they would rather have and just recognize the reality of God's sovereignty and turn back to God in repentance. Repentance is another word for turning away and turning toward. And a relationship through Jesus Christ. Why? Because Jesus Christ is the only one who could get through the goalposts. He lived a perfect life. And He is, as he says to us, He said, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. It's not about religion. It's about a relationship with the one person that can provide for redemption. Or not. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man. There it is, that word, a person who rejects God, who builds his house on the sand, just like those goalposts on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against their house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. I've talked about dread. I've talked about God consciousness. I've talked about what it means to not have the peace that surpasses all understanding. That's my invitation to you tonight. My invitation to you tonight is to allow yourself to once again, I've talked about sensus divinitatis, and it's kind of a funny, it's like, well, my sensus divinitatis got torqued tonight. I mean, it's kind of a strange way of saying it, but your God consciousness is something that you need to attend to. And so you can say the prayer, why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise Him, my salvation and my God. And so if there's folks here with crew tonight, you have others in your life that are followers of Christ. If you would want to attend to that angst, that unsettledness in your soul, then yes, God not only exists, but God invites. And at some point then, you will be able to stand and be able to say, on Christ the solid rock I stand, no other ground is sinking sand, no other ground is sinking sand, all other ground is sinking sand. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Russell and Dr. Spalding. We are now going to take a 5-minute break. As a reminder, if you are a Wayne State student and would like an opportunity to follow up on this evening's debate, you can do 2 things. First, fill out one of the comment cards that are being passed out. They already were in your seats, and there should be more at the tables. And leave them with one of the crew students or at one of the tables out in the hallway, and crew will be following up with you. Second, send an email to wsu@ratiochristi.org and put brainstorming breakfast in the subject line of your email. You will receive a doodle invitation to be the guest of Ratio Christi at a brainstorming breakfast with Dr. Spalding and Ratio Christi members, where you can ask questions and engage in further discussion. We are now taking a short break. When we come back, if you want to ask a question of either or both speakers, join the line at the microphone to your left at the front of the auditorium. We'll see you in 5 minutes.
Bruce, thank you so
Thanks.
much. Hey, I promise not to sing anymore.
I promise never to sing. That'd be terrible.
Convene here,
Testing.
so if you could have a seat, that would be great. And we will begin with our question and answers. So our questions will be at the microphone. Once again, if we could have some quiet, that'd be great. Once again, let me just remind you, if you could just take 1 minute to offer your question, and then we'll have time for answers following that. Okay, I think we've got our first question. Go ahead, please. Aim the mic down a little bit. Downwards. Yeah, point it towards.
Okay. Are you ready?
That's better.
Okay. So, Professor Russell, in your response to the creation argument, you mentioned that naturalists have a brute fact and that this universe doesn't have an explanation, but this brute fact is shared by creationists, because you say that there's no explanation as to why God chose this universe, correct?
Yeah.
I think that this is an equivocation on the term explanation, because the brute fact about this universe not having an explanation is a violation of the principle of sufficient reason, meaning that this universe existing is not contingent on something existing prior, whereas God choosing this universe is not a violation of PSR, because say if I throw my folder across the room, you might not know why I did that, why my mind decided to do that, but that action is contingent upon my body existing, my mind existing. So God's creation of this universe is not a violation of the principle of sufficient reason, because him choosing this universe is contingent on him existing prior, but the universe, being a brute fact, is a violation of the principle of sufficient reason, because the universe just exists without any explanation, is not contingent on anything existing prior.
Okay, so I have two answers. One is, not everybody accepts the principle of sufficient reason. Some of you maybe don't know, but the principle of sufficient reason says that everything that is has a reason why it is and why it is the way it is, roughly. And so some people don't accept that some physicists think that subatomic events are random. They have no reason why the silver ion goes this way rather than that way between two poles of a magnet. But suppose I grant the principle of sufficient reason just for the sake of argument. Then I think that the God explanation, A, does violate it because there's no explanation of why he chose this universe rather than another. And secondly, even if it didn't violate the principle of sufficient reason, the God hypothesis, there are those other considerations I enter about questions about mystery about causality and mystery about God's reasons, which count against any hypothesis that has those elements in it. So if you have two explanations, now just granting somehow the principle of sufficient reason is answered, and you have two bad explanations, you should not accept either one. You should suspend judgment. So that it goes three ways. Not everybody accepts the principle of sufficient reason. Forget that. They do accept the principle of sufficient reason. I don't think God's choosing this universe rather than some other equally good one satisfies the principle of sufficient reason because there's no reason. And third, even if I waive that one, the God hypothesis suffers because it introduces these impenetrable mysteries.
My question is for you, Professor.
Thank you.
I'm standing here just because I'm trying to avoid these lights.
So God is supposed to be a perfect and all-merciful. Yet if someone is gay or has an abortion, God will damn them to hell.
Okay.
God is also supposed to be all-willing and all-able, yet he is not willing or able to end suffering. I wouldn't want to follow a God that is not, that believes in that. Also, I just prove that God is like imperfect, therefore God cannot exist. How can you explain God's perfections?
Okay.
Imperfections?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get all of your question, but I think I got the gist of it, is that there is terrible suffering. Did you mention abortion?
I was saying that God and the Bible says God will send gay and people who have abortions to hell.
Okay.
And I'm saying that contradicts the Bible saying he's all merciful. That makes him a hateful God, yes.
Okay. I need to work with you a little bit on what the Bible says. Okay. So the Bible does not say that all gay people or all people who have an abortion are going to hell. It does not say that at all. It does lift up.
Too close to that mic.
Oh, okay. It does elevate our idea of life and our idea of procreation to the sacred from the profane. It lifts it up. It says that the joining of a man and a woman is a sacred event. It's not just a physical event. It has sacred ideals. So there is an elevation, which then elevates the notion of sex. It elevates the notion of being really concerned about the sacredness of life. But the Bible also acknowledges the fact that a lot of people do a lot of bad things, and a lot of people do things that violate even the sacredness of life.
Yet God is not willing or able to end that.
And so God provides redemption through Christ. There are God's forgiveness, God's mercy, God's salvation is greater than any evil that you or I could even imagine. Because there is no sin that is more powerful or greater than the salvation that is made available through Christ. No sin at all. So, yes, there is an elevation of life, a sacredness of life that it is very countercultural in a world that wants to degrade life in so many ways. Thank you.
Actually, he changed my question, so let me rephrase it really quick.
Who changed your question?
He did actually. He said
What
he
did
would
you-
want to
why
follow
did you-
God. No. What he said changed my question.
okay.
He ended it with, "That's not a God I would want to follow."
I'm going after the man who changed your question. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry. What's your question?
He said, "That's not a God I would like to follow." And you brought up Dostoevsky earlier. And in the Brothers Karamazov, do you think Ivan's decision to return his ticket to God, do you know what I'm talking about?
No, you'll have to remind me.
He's a very faithful Russian man, but he believes, and the problem of evil is too much to overcome.
Right.
He doesn't give up his faith in God. He actually, it's a very quoteful line, "I return my ticket to heaven." He says that God's evil, or the fact that God lets evil exist on earth, is too much of an grievance, and that no one should follow him.
Yeah.
Do you think his logic is too over the top? And this is an open question for both. Or do you support the logic in that decision?
Well, what you're saying sounds to me like some of the new atheists, like Christopher Hitchens, who is now a theist, where they're saying, "I am so disgusted, I am so offended by this and this and this and this, by this evil and this, that I want nothing to do with a God who would allow that to happen." And am I stating the problem?
No, that's it exactly.
Okay. And so there's a couple ways to think about that. One is the question that was asked of Job. Where were you at the foundation of the earth? In other words, who are you to superimpose your puny little human logic over the top of this immense 3 septillion stars worth of a universe that I have created that brings glory to me, to God? Who are you to even raise, to cast that, to have that kind of a rebellious attitude toward me? And so that's basically, the answer to that is, well, I'm not, and I guess I need the salvation of Christ because I cannot negotiate with God any other way. So I don't know if you have a thought on that, Dr. Russell.
I don't know if the situation you described, the person still had faith, but says, I returned my ticket, meaning I don't want to have
it's
any
a
part of you.
Dostoevsky novel, which you brought him up earlier in your slide.
Oh,
And,
Dostoevsky, yeah.
Yes, the brothers Karamazov.
Yeah.
And he continues his faith. He has a firm belief in God, but he says that a God that allows evil doesn't deserve the faith of the mass, doesn't deserve the faith of the people.
I don't understand why he still has faith. If I believed, as I do, the problem of evil is a sound argument for the non-existence of God, I wouldn't believe that God exists. I wouldn't have faith. Why? That's what he should say. I know what he says, yeah. Didn't make any sense to me.
Okay. I just wanted to get your take on the logic of his choice.
No, doesn't make any sense. If you really think the problem of evil is a sound argument, you should disbelieve.
Okay. Thank you.
But before you, can I just quickly, before I'll say one thing real quickly. No, the premise that's being stated here is that God has a duty to intervene, intercept, and interrupt impending evil. And that is the only protocol that makes sense to the human being. And it isn't the only protocol. So anyway, go ahead.
So my question is for Professor Russell. What are your thoughts on why, like, at its base, killing a person is wrong? Like, why would you say exactly?
What is wrong?
Killing a person.
Killing an innocent person.
Ending a life, yeah.
It's like math. There's a fact, a necessary truth, that killing an innocent person is wrong. Like genocide is wrong, and 2 + 2 is 4, and at least in the Euclidean geometry, the Pythagorean theorem is true. You don't need anything to support mathematics. You don't need anything, some other being to make it true that 2 + 2 is 4, or genocide is wrong. These are necessary truths which, when we understand them, our reason grasps that they are necessary. There's no possible world in which they're false. You can't imagine a world where they're false. You can imagine a world where people think they're false, but that doesn't cut any ice.
But if reality is purely objective, right?
As in
Why-
math, like math reality?
Sure, yeah. Why would the ending of consciousness be any worse than its continuation?
Because consciousness is a good thing. Free will is a good thing. I go along with the theists about that. If you ask them why it's a good thing, I think they should say it's intrinsically good. And I say consciousness is intrinsically good, that if I had a choice to create a world with consciousness and reason, rational animals or not, I would create a world with rational animals who are conscious, because it's better to be conscious than not. Ask yourself, if not, somebody says, look, I'll give you a chance. We're not going to kill you, but we're going to scramble your brain. So you don't have any consciousness, but you have a brain stem so you can breathe. What would you say, okay, it's not good in itself, flip a coin, I'll go either way. No one would say that. Everyone would say, if I have a choice to be conscious and rational or not, give me that over scrambling my brain.
Okay, thank you.
Question for Dr. Russell. Your argument about God doesn't exist was primarily around evil and suffering or excess suffering.
Yeah.
As human beings progress, we know we've made a lot of advances from the last 6,000 years to today. If in the next 400 years we manage somehow to eliminate suffering because of hunger, eliminated suffering because of disease, potentially eliminated wars and suffering from that kind of destruction, would you then come back and say God exists?
No.
There's no more suffering.
No.
We eliminated suffering in 400 years.
We eliminated suffering. Suppose it's all gone, you say? Is that what you're imagining?
Yeah.
Let's do that.
Because right now it's due to hunger,
So-
due to wars, due to climate change. We managed to
Yeah.
fix the climate issues
Yeah.
and eliminated all excess suffering.
Yeah.
There's a little bit suffering left. For example, I want to become a boxer. I got to go through the pain and the hurt and everything else to become a great boxer.
Yeah.
That suffering doesn't get eliminated. But
I
the
got it.
majority of it is eliminated.
So how about this? Here's an analogy. You can't forget history. There was suffering, terrible, excessive suffering in the universe, and that God would not create such a universe. Even if eventually it's eliminated by us humans, this history can't be ignored. I'll give you an analogy. There's a really bad guy, and all he does is torture kids. And then he reforms. There's some kind of reason why, he thinks, wow, that's not really the way to live. And so, do we say that there was never evil in the world? There was never an evil person because now the evil man has reformed? No, we said evil existed in an excessive amount. That guy was a bad guy. In the same way, you can't ignore the history which leads up to your hypothetical, which I accept. I love doing hypotheticals. Your hypothetical conclusion in 400 years. But why did he create a universe and allow it for so many thousands of years, all of this excessive suffering?
And if I can, just one more.
Yeah.
Along that argument, then should we say that since there was, cannibalism was okay at one time, human beings are bad and we should just get rid of them?
That doesn't follow at all.
Because, at one time, cannibalism was okay. At
No,
one
I
time,
don't believe
slavery
that.
was okay.
Oh, no,
We
that's
eliminated
not
that. Does that mean the human being is intrinsically bad? We grew.
No, that wouldn't follow. It would follow that some human beings are bad, and I don't accept for a minute that slavery was ever right or that cannibalism was right. People thought that. People thought that gay relationships were wrong, and now people are beginning to think, oh, they're not wrong. I say it's like math. You don't know all the math facts when we knew just 2 minus 1 was 1, but number theory is pretty sophisticated. Morality's just developing. Come on, hang with me, take my classes when I teach foundations of ethics. And so I say no. Those things were always wrong. They will be wrong. They were wrong. People didn't recognize it. Even if I grant you, well, I always do this. Okay, I'll grant you your hypothesis. They weren't wrong. It doesn't follow that we should get rid of people because they have some evil actions or evil motives in them. It may be that they're worth saving. They're not completely evil. So none of this follows from what you say. That's my argument. It doesn't follow that we shouldn't disbelieve in God because now in 400 years there's no suffering, because don't forget there was. And none of this stuff follows. It's not true that slavery was sometimes right. What's true is people wrongly, mistakenly thought it was okay. And even if I'm wrong about that, to summarize, it doesn't follow we should kill humans or get rid of them. It doesn't mean that they're completely bad because they have some bad traits or did some bad things. That's my answer.
Let me just throw one observation in there, and that is that I fully agree with Dr. Russell that we can know right and wrong. The Bible says that God writes his law on our heart. We can suppress that, though. And the question is, under what authority, then, do we judge the suppression of God's law? Dr. Russell often refers to the Holocaust. But we have to remember that in the wake of the Holocaust, there were the Nuremberg trials. And the Nuremberg trials had to wrestle with all of this evil that took place, and how do you sort that out? And at the end of the day, they had to resort to God's law. They got there by way of the law of nations, which is based goes all the way back really to the Middle Ages, based on the law of God. So at the end of the day, you can't have squishy ethics, and you can't say, well, it's really obvious this is right, and this is really obvious that that's wrong, and oh, maybe this isn't quite as wrong as we thought. Now maybe this is. Squishy ethics is what you have going through time. The reliable articulation of right and wrong requires a larger foundation than that, and it requires a sacred text. It requires the Ten Commandments, it requires the Bible. And that is written on our heart, but we can reject it. And that's where we get into justice, as opposed to worrying about how much suffering. It's not God's job to minimize suffering and maximize pleasure. That's not his purpose. It might be our purpose. It's not his purpose.
But I didn't say that. So I want to make sure that
Well, you
have
did. You
my...
said first homosexuality is right, now it's wrong, then this is right.
Oh, no. If anybody who knows me, and you can tell this from just listening to me tonight, if you take my classes, you'll really know this, I do not have squishy ethics. I have very definite views about right and wrong. And I said slavery was always wrong. Homosexual relations was always permissible. I didn't say that, but I will say it now. And I think eating people, except when you're in the Andes and the plane crashes and you have to eat somebody, that's okay. They're dead, you eat them. What's wrong with that?
It gets squishy because slavery is
They're not
wrong, but
squishy.
indentured servitude, now when does that become right and wrong? When does
It's always been right or wrong. It's just we have to think
indentured
hard.
servitude when somebody agrees to indenture themselves? Is that wrong?
What's that?
When indentured servitude, when somebody indentures themselves voluntarily, is that wrong?
Indentured servants?
Indentured servitude, yes.
Probably wrong,
Yes,
but
this is,
but no,
this,
no,
this
no,
is
no.
the squishiness that comes in.
No. Anybody who has a sophisticated moral view, or any view in epistemology or any normative topic, should admit that there are hard cases and easy cases. There are always borderline cases. How many beans are in a heap? If you have 1,000 beans stacked in a conical structure, you've got a heap. If you have 3 beans, you don't have a heap. But there's a lot of gray area between heaps and not heaps. And anybody who denies that shouldn't. And it's the same thing about hard moral cases. I talk about abortion. I just started talking about abortion in my medical ethics class. I think there are easy cases and hard cases. Late-term abortions involving the mother's life is in danger, or she's a 12-year-old girl who will suffer the rest of her life, and the embryo fetus is only 10 weeks old. You should wonder about that case. If you have clear ethics there, then you're in trouble.
Hi, this is for Professor Russell. Sticking with the same topic, obviously, Alex Rosenberg of Duke says that it is inconsistent for an atheist to hold to morality because it's not in the worldview. And I think you might disagree with him by what you've been saying tonight, but I'm still curious of what is that basis of morality that you come from? As Professor Spalding said, is that there's gradations along the line. What now becomes unnecessary suffering in your argument versus just suffering or much suffering?
Yeah. Okay, so there's 2 questions I think you've asked. One is, Rosenberg says that it's incompatible with atheism. Well, here, I'm an atheist. I tell you I'm an objectivist, and I told you why. If you say to me, look, you can't be an atheist and believe that there are objective mathematical truths, I say, are you kidding me? Of course there are. And I say, are you kidding me? Of course there are objective moral truths. Are there hard cases? I just said there are hard cases, and everybody better recognize it, whether they're a theist or an atheist. About the other question about how much suffering is excessive, the answer is the heap answer. There are gray areas between a heap and a non-heap. There are clear cases of heaps. There are clear cases of excessive unnecessary suffering. In the little toy case I gave, I imagined that the judge imposed a life sentence for stealing some food from a convenience store. That was excessive. Are there hard cases? 364 days or 365? You betcha. I'm saying this is a clear case. The one where all of this suffering of innocence, including animals across the millennia, if that isn't a candidate for excessive unnecessary suffering, I don't know what is, and I think you have to deny there are heaps.
Okay, thank you.
I have walked in the colonias, squatter camps, along the northern border of Mexico, and I have sat on a milk crate and prayed with people there. I've been in a similar situation along the municipal dump just outside of San Jose, Costa Rica. My wife and I have worked with rural teens with Crossroads Farm in Hillsdale County, dealing with young people who have dirt floors, they don't have running water. The idea of a cell phone is so far beyond them that it's just not even imaginable. I've seen and heard stories of Christians in camps in North Korea who are tortured and tormented. And I've seen statistics that said the most persecuted group demographic in the world are Christian women. They're persecuted because they're women, they're persecuted because they're Christian. In all of these situations where those who are followers of Christ, they have hope. They are enduring horrendous suffering. They have hope. And so what I'm left with as I think about what suffering means in the lives of so many people, what I think about is the hope. You can have a wonderful life, you can live on a hill in a castle and be empty. And you can be going through a doggy door in a prison camp in North Korea and not allowed to look up because they won't say God, but they say that they believe in heaven and they're not allowed to look up to heaven. And they can have hope. And so I guess I'm just not impressed with all these discussions about this is necessary, this is not necessary, this is a little bit of suffering, this is excessive suffering. It just doesn't, at the end of the day, people don't commit suicide as much because of physical suffering than they do because of despair. That's why people take their lives, is despair. And so I want to be focused on what it means to have hope. I know there's a lot of suffering in the world. Of course there is. We live in a fallen world. But where is the hope? And that's what I find so inspiring. It's what I find so tied so closely to faith in Christ.
So I think the conditions for rational hope are quite different from the conditions for rational belief. That I think it's rational for me to believe that when I play the lottery, and the chances are, 1 in 260 million, that I won't win. Is it rational for me to hope that I win? Yeah. Is it rational for me to act on that hope? Probably not. If I said, man, I'd really like to move back to California to my ranch and build this mansion there, and I hope that I win the lottery, so I'm going to quit my job and bank on the hope. Crazy. Do not do it. Hope is one thing, belief is another. What you should act on are rational beliefs, not rational hopes. Does it have, I didn't hear a pragmatic argument. It was from Bert till now. I do address pragmatic arguments for the existence of God, and I say there's some benefits for believing in God. That's what Pascal's wager was about. He said, I know there's not really good evidential arguments for the existence of God, but here's a wager. The wager doesn't work, but the general idea is, let's just talk about the benefits of believing or hoping or whatever. There are some, and they have a downside too, that people put too much hope in things and they live their lives in the wrong ways because the beliefs, the rational beliefs, don't support their hopes. And the worry is that the alternative is, as Bertrand Russell said in his famous essay, A Free Man's Worship, you can, for the most part, get all those psychological goods by having a group of friends, even if they're a group of atheists or amazingly philosophers, and lead a very, very good life. And you do not have to abandon your reason and have rational beliefs and happiness in your life. What a deal.
Okay, thanks for both of you guys for being here tonight. My question is for Professor Spalding. So what I would like to do is I would like to just grant you the truth of all of the arguments that you offered in the opening statement of your presentation. I take it that the argument from the historical facts about Jesus would prove something specific about Christianity, right? It would give us reason to take Christianity to be true. Outside of that argument in particular, of the arguments that you presented, I was just wondering if you thought that any of those arguments gave you reason to think that Christianity was true as opposed to just a belief in a monotheistic God, and if time permits, why did those arguments give you reason?
That's a great question. Thank you. I really appreciate that question. And yes, I do believe, or I do think, that when you look at those other arguments, when you look at the argument, the argument for existence, you look at biological information, you look at the laws of physics, and you look at how huge, large, awesome, incredibly just amazing creation is, that you end up with a big God. And in comparison to Judaism and Islam, you end up with a God who's so big you can't earn your way back to God. And that to me, and that really that is the story of the Old Testament. The Old Testament is a story of just grinding this cycle where God blesses and reveals and then what happens? There's rebellion, and so then people repent, and so then God blesses. It's just this constant cycle. And it's the whole thing that even Jesus dealt with when he walked on this earth, is creating a structure that says, I get through this, I punch these tickets, I do these things, and I'm good to go. That reduces God. And so it's the largeness of God that you get from those other arguments that tell me that God is holy and righteous. Thank you.
All right, my question is for Dr. Russell. I was wondering how strong you thought the problem of evil, or the argument from the problem of evil, actually is. Do you think it's just strong enough to make it rationally permissible to doubt the existence of God, or do you actually think that the argument rationally requires you to reject the existence of God?
So I actually think it rationally requires disbelief. That's a sound argument, the conclusion of which is God doesn't exist. It's not that it's permissible, rationally permissible to disbelieve. It's rationally required, because all of the premises seem to me rationally required to believe. And if it's rationally required to believe each of the premises and you know that the conclusion follows, it's rationally required you believe the conclusion which says God doesn't exist. So I do think that people are being irrational if they believe in God, but not necessarily. Maybe you haven't heard the problem of evil before, or maybe you haven't heard the best version, or maybe you have some really tricky, like Peter Van Inwagen, replies to my argument. But if you don't, and you heard this argument and you can't refute it, you're required to believe the conclusion.
Thank you, Bruce.
This question is for Dr. Spalding. Right?
Yes.
You believe in science, right? Correct?
Yes. Well, I believe that I don't. It's interesting. Dr. Russell said science explains this.
Oh, yeah.
I believe that science produces data and information.
All right. So you basically science is like the way of understanding how God creates things and how God's worlds work, right?
No, I don't think science tells us how God creates things. I think that science creates an inference that things were created.
Okay. My point is, like,
I'm sorry, I'm not trying to quibble with you.
Oh, no,
really
that's right. I mean, the Earth exists, and then there's like a septillion universe out there, right? And you said that God came in the form of Jesus Christ, correct?
That's correct, yes.
So why would God, this almighty, powerful being, creator of this huge entire universe, we're not even able to actually see with our telescopes or even comprehend, come to a single planet in a form of a simple human being.
Correct.
So that kind of seems like, I feel like a God that is so powerful, why would he care about a single planet, a single life form?
I don't know. Because I can't comprehend that level of love.
I have an answer.
God so loved the world that he gave his son. It's love. I mean, John 3:16 tells it is love. But I have a hard time comprehending that level of love. Now, when you put it in the context of a tiny little earth, a puny little earth, in a relatively modest galaxy of 100 billion stars, among 100 billion other galaxies, it really helps magnify that. How is it that God would do that? And I will tell you that if you look at the position of the Earth within the galaxy, where we can see out, if you look at the way the moon is lined up, it's 400 times the size, smaller than the Earth, and the distance is 400. That allows us to have a perfect eclipse, which is, by the way, how we were able to verify the general theory of relativity of Einstein, because we could see light bending around the eclipse. All of the world is created, the universe is created to entice our curiosity, to lead us to discover. We're given curiosity, we're given logic, and what is happening is God reveals himself to us in everything that we have. Even the size of the universe, the current thinking in the Big Bang is that there were only a few basic elements that came into existence at the time of the Big Bang. It took stellar nuclearization to create the rest of the elements. So there's just a whole lot going on that tells us about the glory of God. And you're right. It humbles us to think that God would love the world so much he would give his only son. I have a son, I have a daughter, I have a granddaughter. And if you look cross-eyed at my granddaughter, I'm on the defense. I mean, I just can't imagine giving my granddaughter or my son or my daughter over because of a love for a bunch of rebellious people. But so that's why I say I don't quite get the love, but it is the love.
You have a response, Dr. Russell?
I was going to say that I don't know why the Christians don't say that there are billions of planets just like ours all over the universe, and there's a Christ in each one of them.
Is that also?
Sounds plausible.
Is that also
Huh?
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My question is for Dr. Russell. Since science was brought up, my question is, well, before the question, is one thing that I find hard to ponder is why there's death. Why death so evidently reigns over the world.
Yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, earlier you acknowledged that you take the stance as an atheist based on science,
Yeah.
right?
Well, partly. I'm an atheist because of the problem of evil, actually.
Okay. What's your take on the reason why we die? I mean, you could say it's because of old age, but old age is really the ultimate how we die. So either we die from critical illness, somebody gets murdered, an accident happens,
Fall off the stage.
or plain old age, right? What's your take on why we die?
Okay, I got it. So we're made of organic matter. Plants are made of organic matter. Organic matter has a propensity to deteriorate and disintegrate. It is in the nature of our matter. And, well, the universe has this matter. How it evolved, it's a big scientific, question I don't know all the answers to, but I think it's a scientific question of why we have the kind of organic matter we do. And then given we have that kind of organic matter, it's in its nature to gradually disintegrate.
Thank you. And if you want to add something, that would be cool too.
Death entered the world because of the sin of Adam. That's all I have to say about that.
So I have a question for you, Professor Spalding. So one of your proofs of God existing is that the universe exists and that something can't come from nothing.
Right.
That's common sense. So it makes most sense, and I agree with you that God created the universe. So do you think that God was always there, or was he created himself?
God was always there.
So
God
then
is
how
the
did we get to this present moment, though? Because if time goes back forever, to go from the beginning of time, which goes back ad infinitum, to get to this present moment is an infinite amount of time traveled. No matter how far you travel along that timeline, it's still infinity. So how do you, if God has existed forever, how do you get to this moment?
He spoke. God spoke energy into existence, space into existence, time into existence, matter into existence. And when God spoke, he created. What happens when you speak? It takes time to speak. And so there was a moment of the creation of time. And that's what the Bible tells us, and isn't it amazing? And of course, the Big Bang Theory is very deficient in many ways.
So then that doesn't make any sense.
Well, it
though.
makes sense if God is a person and God is intentional and that God can make a decision.
So then you're defining that he is actually something, but you just said that he was there before there was anything. So how can you begin to define something when there's no objects to even refer to?
He was always there, and then he created. Thank you.
I think the answer to this question is hard. It assumes that to get around this problem of God existing in time infinitely, and how could you ever traverse an infinite, people have to posit that God existed outside of time and then created things like the Big Bang, and time began with the Big Bang. It sounds pretty good, except you wonder if you say God always existed, it sounds like you mean at every moment of time he existed. And I always say to my students, there was a creation, but creation suggests that this thing is now existing. Suppose I create a pot out of clay. Before this time, there wasn't a clay pot, and then I created it, and now there's a clay pot. But I think creation actually logically implies, that there was a time when the thing didn't exist, a time, and then a time when it did. But that is not the story about how on this timeless God doing something, created something. I think implies that there must have been a time before the Big Bang, and then he created the world, but then he didn't create time, because time already pre-existed in order for the creation, by its very meaning of the concept, implies there was a previous time. So I think it's a conundrum, a kind of, I can't solve this kind of paradox, and so I think that's why the gentleman asked the question, said, I don't really understand. So there are two alternatives. God existed always in time and infinitely, and there's these arguments that the physical universe couldn't have existed infinitely, so then God couldn't have existed infinitely in time. So the only other alternative is he existed outside of time, but then creation is impossible for a being that exists outside of time. So there's no good answer to this creation question about God and creating the universe and the like.
Unless you're God.
What's that?
Unless you are God.
You mean?
There's no answer that you or I can come up with, because we're not God.
Yeah, so in other words, we can't understand it. We can't understand this hypothesis that you're putting forth, because it's a dilemma that we can't grasp, but nevertheless you believe it's true. That doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, you believe it's a dilemma.
Say what?
You believe it's a dilemma.
I believe what?
You believe that it is a dilemma. You know,
it is a dilemma.
We
I just gave you the dilemma.
Yeah, it's a dilemma to you.
It's a dilemma. Come on, Bert. Either God existed infinitely in time, or he was timeless. Those are the two options. If he exists infinitely in time, the theist argues against that possibility, because otherwise the atheist says, well, the physical universe existed infinitely in time. So the theist can't offer that leg of the dilemma. The other leg of the dilemma is that he existed outside of time and created time. But that's a dilemma, because he can't create something unless there's time in which he creates it. So there's the dilemma. If you're going to criticize the dilemma, you have to say one of those premises in the two legs are false. I don't get it. Which one? Either infinite time, he existed infinitely in time, or he existed timelessly. Those are the choices.
Unfortunately, we're also facing another time dilemma.
Time
which
is finite.
We've come to 9 o'clock. I don't mind continuing to the discussion. Dr. Spalding, you might be more aware of whether we are permitted to continue the discussion.
We're not. We're out of here.
Okay.
We're being evicted.
Okay, so let me give the mic to Joshua, and he'll say a few closing things for us.
Well, thank you all for coming. This concludes this evening's debate event. Remember to fill out a comment card if you are interested in any kind of follow-up with Crew or with Bert. You can send him an email again at wsu@ratiochristi.org if you are interested in being invited to a brainstorming event breakfast. Thank you both guys, and thank you all for coming. Good night.
Thank you.